There is a reason the story of the hero appears almost everywhere. Across mythology, religion, fairy tales, and modern cinema, we repeatedly encounter the same basic pattern. An ordinary person leaves the familiar world, enters the unknown, faces danger, confronts a monster, experiences a transformation, and eventually returns with something valuable. We recognize these stories because, on a psychological level, they mirror something deeply human. The hero represents the part of us that is willing to leave what is familiar, confront what frightens us, and become something we were not before. In Jungian psychology, however, the hero is more complicated than simply being brave, strong, or victorious. The hero can be understood as an archetypal pattern associated with the development of consciousness and the ego's struggle to separate itself from the unconscious. Jung saw myths of the hero as symbolic expressions of psychological development. The hero leaves a state of unconscious identification, encounters forces larger than the ego, and gradually establishes a more differentiated sense of self. But there is an important paradox here. The hero must become strong enough to stand alone, yet eventually must discover that the ego is not the whole psyche. This is where the hero's journey begins. At first, the hero belongs to the ordinary world. There is a familiar identity, familiar relationships, and familiar rules. Everything seems relatively stable until something disrupts that stability. The call to adventure arrives. Psychologically, this can be a crisis, a loss, a relationship, a sudden realization, or simply a growing feeling that the life we are living no longer fits who we are becoming. Something inside us knows that we cannot remain exactly as we are. The ego often resists this call. We prefer what we know, even when what we know is no longer good for us. The unknown is frightening because it contains possibilities we cannot control. The hero therefore begins with a tension between security and transformation. One part of us wants to stay where we are, while another part knows that something has to change. Once the hero crosses the threshold, the familiar rules no longer apply. This threshold can be understood as the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious. We enter psychological territory where our usual strategies may fail. We encounter unfamiliar emotions, unexpected desires, fears, and contradictions. We may discover aspects of ourselves that don't fit our previous identity. And this is where the hero begins meeting the figures that populate the unconscious: the mentor, the enemy, the helper, the shadow, the trickster, and eventually the forces that cannot simply be conquered. The shadow is perhaps the hero's most important encounter. The monster outside the hero often represents something that also exists within the hero. The dragon, demon, beast, or enemy becomes an image of everything the conscious personality has rejected or fears. This is why hero stories are so psychologically powerful. The hero believes that the monster is the problem, only to discover that the real challenge is what the monster represents. We often do something similar in ordinary life. We identify the source of our frustration outside ourselves. We believe that another person is the reason we are angry, insecure, or afraid. Sometimes there genuinely are external problems, of course. But our emotional reactions can also reveal unconscious material. The hero's battle, therefore, becomes an inner battle. The question is no longer simply, how do I defeat this? But, what is this showing me about myself? This is where the hero differs from the fantasy of simply becoming powerful. Psychological heroism is not about eliminating everything that frightens us. It is about developing enough consciousness to encounter it without being completely possessed by it. The hero learns to stand in relationship to the unconscious rather than being swallowed by it. But the hero also contains a danger: inflation. Once we discover strength, courage, or psychological insight, the ego can become convinced that it has conquered everything. We may begin identifying with being the strong one, the healer, the wise one, the survivor, or the person who can handle anything. The hero can become addicted to the battle. Every problem becomes another monster to defeat. Every relationship becomes a challenge. Every difficulty becomes something to overcome. And this is where the hero eventually encounters one of the most important lessons of individuation. Not everything can be conquered by force. There are experiences that require surrender rather than control. There are wounds that cannot simply be defeated. There are aspects of the unconscious that cannot be forced into submission. The hero who believes that strength means never being vulnerable eventually discovers that vulnerability itself can be a form of strength. This is one of the reasons the hero's journey is not simply a story about winning. The deeper story is about transformation. The hero who returns from the journey is not the same person who left. Something has died. An old identity has been abandoned. A new relationship with the world has emerged. The hero has gained something, but usually at a cost in psychological terms. This can resemble the process of individuation. We begin with an identity shaped largely by our environment. We become who our family, culture, and relationships teach us to be. Eventually, however, something inside us demands differentiation. We have to discover what actually belongs to us. This doesn't mean rejecting everyone who influenced us. It means becoming conscious of what we have inherited so that we can decide what to keep. The hero, therefore, represents the movement from dependence toward conscious individuality. The child begins in a world where others provide meaning and protection. The developing person gradually has to leave that psychological paradise. They encounter difficulty, responsibility, and uncertainty. They learn that nobody else can live their life for them. But Jung's understanding of psychological development doesn't end with the hero. In fact, the hero eventually has to be surpassed. This is a subtle but extremely important point. The hero represents the strengthening and differentiation of the ego. But the ultimate goal of individuation is not ego glorification. It is a relationship between the ego and the self. The ego needs to become strong enough to encounter the unconscious, but not so inflated that it believes it is the center of everything. The hero must eventually discover that there is something larger than the hero. This is where the hero's relationship with the self becomes profound. The self represents the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious. The hero represents the individual consciousness moving through transformation. The hero acts, struggles, and chooses. The self represents the larger wholeness toward which the journey moves in this sense. The hero is not the final archetype of psychological development. The hero is a stage in the journey toward wholeness. And this is why the hero needs the trickster. The trickster disrupts the hero's certainty. The hero wants a mission, a monster, and a victory. The trickster asks whether the hero has misunderstood the situation entirely. The hero wants to be noble. The trickster reminds him that he is still human. The hero wants to control the journey. The trickster introduces chaos. The two archetypes, therefore, balance one another. Without the hero, we may never develop the courage to leave the familiar. Without the trickster, we may become rigid and inflated in our idea of what the journey is supposed to look like. The hero also has a relationship with the persona. The hero may create an identity around being strong, capable, or exceptional. But eventually, this identity itself may become a mask. The person who has spent their entire life being the strong one may have no idea how to ask for help. The person who always rescues others may never allow themselves to be rescued. The person who constantly fights for everyone else may not know what they actually want at some point. The hero must put down the sword. This doesn't mean becoming passive. It means discovering that not every psychological problem is solved through battle. Sometimes the next step is acceptance. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is forgiveness. Sometimes it is admitting that we are afraid. Sometimes it is walking away rather than fighting harder. The hero's greatest transformation may therefore occur when strength changes its meaning at the beginning. Strength means being able to defeat the monster. Later, strength may mean being able to face the monster without becoming it. And eventually, strength may mean knowing when the sword is no longer necessary. This is particularly important when we consider the modern obsession with overcoming adversity. We are constantly encouraged to be resilient, productive, strong, and successful. There is value in resilience, but psychologically, there can also be a hidden trap. If we identify completely with overcoming, we may unconsciously create a life in which we always have something to overcome. The hero needs an enemy to justify the hero identity. Jungian psychology invites us to look deeper. What if the goal isn't to become endlessly stronger? What if the goal is to become more whole? Wholeness includes strength, but it also includes vulnerability. It includes independence, but also connection. It includes courage, but also fear. It includes action, but also stillness. The hero must eventually integrate the qualities that the heroic identity has left behind. This is why the hero's journey can be seen as a movement through death and rebirth. Something old must die so that something new can emerge. The old identity may have protected us once, but eventually it becomes too small.